I'm Michelle,
And I'm Catherine,
and we're here at the Healthy Hurried Human podcast,
where we talk about keeping pace in a world that never slows down. Welcome back to the Healthy Hurried Human podcast. Today we're going to be discussing positive self-growth. Michelle, why don't you explain to us how we define positive self-growth?
Yep. So, in positive self-growth, we're probably going to revisit an analogy that we did from way back in episode 1, where we talk about self-mastery. This one, the spoke on the wheel, really supports the overall view of self-mastery, but dives a little bit deeper into what exactly is that. I define positive self-growth of it's important to know that we are ever changing. We're either growing or we are in a state of decay, in the sense of we're regressing, but we're either progressing or we're regressing is probably a better way to put it. Neutrality is not progress. And so positive self-growth, it goes back to my analogy about kudzu, where it's invasive and it's still it's always growing, or we're in decay, or, which I don't love that word, but we're regressing or we're progressing. And it's like, what do you want it to be for yourself? You want to be moving forward. And that's really important, that we're always understanding that we want to be moving forward, because as human beings, we're always developing.
This is one of the spokes on the wheel that has a lot of science behind it, both research for how our brains develop, and in old age, they learn an instrument, do Sudoku, play word games, because our mind is either like you said, it doesn't go to a place of neutral. It doesn't plateau and stabilize. It's either it's moving one direction or another.
That's right. So a lot of people know this. This is a science fact that I think is becoming more prevalent, that people know this because I hear people spout it, is that, our brain is formed by 25. We are who we are at 25. Our brains, and this is true. Your brain is done. It's not going to develop. The frontal lobe is done connecting by the time you're 25. It is done. But we as human beings continue to develop until we pass away. And this is why I think everybody can agree, typically, we aren't the same person at 25 that we are at 45 or 35.
Thankfully.
Thankfully. I was like, there's a joke here. Because we have progressed, we have developed, we are different, we grow. Some people are like, well, that's maturity. Maturity is development. But somewhere between, say, 25 and 45, middle life, something happens to where we kind of forget, or we if we're not intentional, can go into this neutral place. But neutrality, it feels neutral. We may not be building anything, or we may not be intentional, and we sense, or we think it's neutral, or we kind of live in this place of thinking we're being neutral. I'm not doing anything, I'm not regressing, I'm not picking up any bad habits or that kind of stuff. So we think, so I'm not doing that. But if we're not intentional about growing, what happens is that this idea of neutrality leads to stagnation. And that can happen in midlife. And then what happens if we're not aware of that and say, oh my gosh, I need to kind of get the gears going, and I want to progress, and I want to grow as a person, that goes into us in our elderly life. And you start to see more of the effects of what truly looks like a human person kind of in decay. In their mental abilities, and their ability to converse, and I'm not talking about dementia. I'm not talking about diseases. I'm talking about when you're older and you see a person who has not been intentional about positive self-growth. They've just been neutral for decades.
So let's clarify one thing. When you're talking about positive self-growth, and this is why it's on the wheel, could a growth, because like a lot of times in those years that you've described, those middle years, you're learning new things. Like you have children and they go to new schools, and you're at work and you have continuing education. Are are those falling in the category, or are you talking about something more personalized that develops yourself?
Yes, in both.
Okay, great.
Yes,
That
in both.
sums it
In
up.
that you are learning new things, but at other time, but if you're not being intentional about where you're filing that, what you're doing with that, it's not necessarily. I would not categorize that as positive self growth and learning. It's adjusting to a new life phase, a new life season. You're just kind of going with the flow. Positive self growth, it takes intentionality. There has to be the intentionality of it goes to that self-awareness and the self-mastery of looking at yourself, applying what's new and saying, where does this fit into my life and how am I going to then produce something good from it?
So is it self-help, or is it
It
more
can be
self-development?
both. I think it's both. That's my opinion.
So for self-mastery, it's putting that magnifying glass on, saying, what areas do I need help in? And that's going to change throughout, periodically throughout it. It could be
Through your
that
life, yes.
you need a parenting lesson, you need a marriage focus, you need, maybe it's about your body and your health and wellness. But it feeds into self-care,
All of them.
self-awareness.
All of it, yes. Where you're looking at yourself, the spokes on our wheel, and this is where positive self-growth becomes this tool of, maybe it's learning emotional regulation as a parent, because you realize now how you regulate yourself as an emotionally parentally is impacting the way your kid deciphers the world. So I'm going to go do the work on that. That's positive self-growth.
You're right. Yep.
It's that exactly what you just said, that magnifying glass at looking at yourself and saying, and then sometimes it's just interest, or it's just a curiosity, which I'm going to set you up here because I love when you talk about this, about becoming a lifelong learner.
Oh, right.
And that, I think that was really when you came to work with me, positives, I just framed it different, but you already had the knowledge of what positive self-growth is. You just frame it in being a lifelong learner. I'd love for you to kind of share with our listeners your thoughts on being a lifelong learner.
That was something that was modeled for me in my family that I didn't realize was being modeled for me. And it was something that I was taught to respect. People that were lifelong learners. And there are a couple of attributes about that. They don't think they're the smartest person in the room every day. They could be challenged by something and say, maybe I don't know enough about that, and they'll study up on it. And they're willing to learn. They want to learn. They're readers. When my last company, I did internal recruiting. And we had a job behavior assessment we would use that would point out whether you were more of a concrete thinker or an abstract thinker. And the consultant and I were talking about that. And she said, this is one that can be changed over time. Some things you're intrinsically are who you are. But this one is one that changes. And the more reading you do, the more abstract of a thinker you become.
So let me ask you this. Does a lifelong learner always mean they have to be a reader?
I don't know the answer to that. I in that analogy, what she was saying is the way that they have discovered through the psychological testing is that the people who grow in this area to become more abstract, one of their characteristics is they're readers. And so I would expand it I would expand it to say they were learners, and because we've got different ways of taking in information.
That's right.
But there is a part of your brain that it's different of how you assimilate information when you read it or write it. I just recently was watching or listening to an expert talk about taking notes, imprints on the brain differently than reading it off of a screen.
Well, that's also true with, you've heard me say this, speak something out, because your brain then hears it twice. Or
So powerful.
makes a copy of it because it's thinking it, and then when it hears your voice, it like makes another copy. I kind of think of way back when our parents did copies of those sheets and they'd pull out that blue thing. Remember the
carbon? It's literally a sheet,
copy.
a carbon copy, a carbon sheet that would go underneath it.
I feel that's what the brain does when we speak it out.
For those of you who are listening, that's what the CC means, to carbon copy someone.
I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, that's where CC comes from. And blind carbon copy, BCC, and then nobody sees it.
Well, back to the the
random facts.
I'm going to answer the question I asked you. It's an opinion. I just want to make that clear. It's an opinion. I don't think it means we have to be a lifelong learner, we have to be a reader, because I think in our world today, I think it means being open to new information and open to learning. And so whether that's listening to podcasts and listening to shows or watching videos, and you even get into this where we have to know our learning style.
So we had talked about a couple of characteristics of lifelong learners, that they're humble, they're curious, they're abstract thinkers, they're open to new information. They practice, they reflect, they run it through their own filter. They've developed a way to hear something new, run it through their filter, decide if they want to keep it, if they want to reject it, what they want to do with this new information. Just because it's new information doesn't mean you blindly accept it. But in my careers in training and communications and organizational development, I realized that communication is one of my big top 5 strengths. Thank you, Marcus Buckingham, in the discovering my strengths. My number 1 is communication. And if I want to be able to communicate to people, and I really want it to stick, then it's important for me to understand that there are different types of learners that are listening to me. And I might need to present the information in multiple different ways.
That's right.
And so for me as a communicator, it was important to know that, like if I'm doing one-on-one training or development with someone, I need to know how they learn. A great example of this was my sister and had one of her boys had to go overnight at the children's hospital. And I was there when they were doing intake. I'd brought him food. I was sitting in the room and I watched the nurse literally say to my sister, "How do you process information? Do you want it verbally? Do you want it written? Do you need me to, do you need it repeated? Do you need to write it down?" And I was like, this is brilliant. Let's just cut to the chase. I'm going to download a lot of information in a very high emotional setting that I need you to grasp.
How are you going to best remember it?
Right. Mm-hmm. And then not only were they admitting this child, my sister was staying overnight. So they said, "What do we need to know about you?" And it was just, and I'm sitting there going, this is so brilliant.
It is.
Because you're taking a lot of the guesswork out of it and understanding that people learn different ways.
That's right.
So for me, when I was doing recruiting, one of the other books is Love Plus Work. Again, Marcus Buckingham, love this work. He talks a lot about self-mastery. And one of the things he says is that's the best gift you can bring to a job, is to know yourself and know what type of learner are you. And after doing he was doing Instagram sessions when this book was just coming out. And after doing that, it changed the way I interviewed, because when I was interviewing people in learning about them, if they said, "Well, I'm a really fast learner," great. What's your learning style?
Like? Yeah.
What does it look like? Because I knew if you're a great learner, that means you need to be paired with a really great teacher. And I may be hiring you.
And the workplace is not full of those.
Well, I may be hiring you for something that we need a plug and play person, or we need someone who can, if I could know your learning style, then we could do an onboarding approach that is better or different.
Fitted to you.
My scuba diving analogy with my best friend Christy and I were doing scuba diving lessons. And she said at one point, I just need to be left alone so I can go away and practice this and work this all out on my own. And that is not how scuba diving lessons work. And that's her learning style, is just give me a few minutes or time on my own to run through and practice it. And unfortunately, you just can't do that because you got to be underwater. And it's just, it made it more
Right,
complex, which added more frustration. And I had a different learning style than she did. So it was magnified for us in that high pressure environment because there's a lot of nuances to scuba diving.
Right.
That to me, it just stuck out as learning styles get magnified in certain pressure systems
Right.
and school systems. So we all know there are different learning styles, but do we know our own? Are we self-reflective, self-aware? Do we have the self-mastery to know what our learning style is?
I think that, I think people hear things like self-help and they either lean into it or they roll their eyes because they've got certain people that have been around for years who have made a lot of money doing self-help, quotation marks there. And so we either lean in or lean away from it, or you have people who just kind of are like, I don't have time for that. And I wonder if, and this is new, as you're talking, I wonder if people would be more lean into this if they understood, because I don't think adults are walking around understanding how they learn. Because when we do, my story with dyslexia, that I thought I was a terrible learner all through school because nobody told me I had dyslexia. They knew, they tested me and had all the things and they never told me. And then
have you asked them why they didn't tell you?
I don't remember if I've asked.
I have a former colleague of mine who the same thing happened to him. And his parents didn't tell him because they were like, well, we didn't want you to feel bad about yourself. He's like, feel bad about me. I mean, do you know what advantage that would have been?
Right. I think they didn't want, I need to ask my mom. I know I asked her when I found out, why didn't you tell me? And I don't remember the answer. But I feel like, knowing my parents, that there was probably a part of, we didn't want you to have the label, or we didn't want you to live under the label.
Some people, we don't want to give you an excuse to not try hard.
It may have been that, but I'll never forget when Mr. Darnell, if you're listening, it was you, and you were the one that told me. I remember when he mentioned it. I mean, I was literally 2 weeks away from graduating high school. And he's like, he was trying to be helpful. He said, you're going to have to, probably seek some help when you get to college. Cause I hadn't, up until that senior year, thought I was going to college, because I thought, I'm a terrible learner. Why would I go to college and waste my time? And he was right. And I remember him saying, because you're dyslexia. And it was like, my what?
Yeah. I think that in our lifetime, there are so much more advancements.
Of course.
We catch things earlier. We do different assessments.
Absolutely. And yeah, that also coming through the 70s, 80s, we laid the groundwork for where everybody is
welcome.
now. Yes, you're welcome. But going to college, and my story with that, finding the most amazing professor who just identified that and said, we will make you successful. And we have these tools. And he understood dyslexia, and named my first child after him.
But we have tools that we realize it's not giving a child an advantage to give them more time to take a test.
That's right. And so why I kind of got sidetracked there with that's my personal story, but I just remember the light bulb moment, the heavens departing, splitting open, and you see the sunshine, the awe, cue the music moment in my life when I realized, oh my gosh, I can learn and I love it. I fell in love with learning because I learned my learning style. I learned how to learn. And so I'm wondering, back to kind of the original question, is I feel like people would lean into being a lifelong learner if they really understood what their learning style was. How do I best learn? Because learning is amazing.
Well, I have thoughts
when you do it the way you receive it.
I have thoughts on that.
Oh.
I think that there are certain personalities or situations in life where you think you need to be the expert
in the room, yeah.
Or you think that you've learned everything you need to. and I will talk about my litmus test for this, because this is what I use in my own life. I had a professor in college that one day I was talking with a guy I went to school with, and he said, I go to church with that professor, and was sitting in there one Sunday, and I was in the balcony and looked down and saw him taking notes.
The professor.
Saw the professor taking notes. And he said, there's this 35-year-old guy standing up there, and our professor was probably 65. And what he was taking notes from this younger guy. And our professor was very well versed in the Bible and different things like that. So he struck my friend as saying, this guy is learning
notes
from somebody who's inferior to him in a lot
half
of ways.
his age, right?
And that became a litmus test for Catherine, myself, is if I'm in a situation where I think this person can't teach me anything. Or I'm, what do
they know? Right.
What do they know? And granted, that's not, that's, sometimes you're not going to learn something from somebody, and sometimes they don't have, what they're going to say is not value. But that has become a check for me, is if I hear myself say that, or I question myself thinking, there's nothing here for me. He's like, well, but what if there was? And you made a point.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talk about one of the things that there's 3 attributes that we've identified that we need in order to be for positive self-growth or life learner is humility, curiosity, and reflective. And, I love that story about our professor. And it reminded me of something that I had heard and it's that humility part where we have the ability to learn something from every single human being that we encounter, because every human being has encountered and lived something we haven't. They've experienced something in life. So, literally you can learn something if you're open to it, if you're willing to, if they have something to share. And we have that curiosity and that humility to say, you may be in a lowlier place than me in life, but I bet I can learn something from you because you've just lived a life I haven't lived.
When I had one of my inner circle friends was on a different political side than I was. And there were so much similar things. And I just have so much respect for her. And I said to her, what do you see that I don't see that makes you on this side? And my sister made a great point of, if we had more conversations about what we actually share that we agree on. But for me to say to someone, what is it that you see that I don't see? Now, sometimes I have to dig my heels in about things, and I have my own strong opinions. But when I am willing to say to someone, and it's that same principle of, they have walked a different path than me, their experiences are different.
They know one thing I don't know.
Marcus Buckingham talks about the fact that you can grow up in the same family with the same parents, but you're just wired very differently. And if we were much more open to, I'm a very curious extrovert, so I love digging into the nuances with people's lives and their background, their story. However, it's always a better conversation if I ask more questions, and instead of jumping to conclusions or defending my point, to say, tell me how you got there. What was this?
Ted Lasso it. Okay. That's a new thing. That's a new term that people use, is Ted Lasso it, which is humility and curiosity. Did you ever see that?
Oh, I loved it. I
like
love
that.
It.
It's
I remember that scene that it
and
came from.
Carbon copied a lot is that one scene where he's like, if you had been
curious,
been more curious. So I love that. I think we've kind of interspersed why this is important at work as we've been talking. I wanted you, I was hoping you were going to share how new hiring and asking the learning style. And
we really did. That is one of my belief systems of how to make your employees better, is to bring in that self-awareness. And actually the book that I would say to read more was one of my bosses brought this in. He had heard about this book.
It's excellent.
The Heart of Business. And it is this man,
Herbert Jolly.
Yes, his story on kind of the self-discovery for himself. And also, again, two of my favorites, Life Plus Work and Now Discover Your Strengths by Marcus Buckingham. These are some of my favorite things to give to recent college graduates or people that I'm working with or helping them with in their career studies, because I truly believe that the knowing yourself is that self-mastery and self-awareness, and you will find ways for yourself to thrive in a job. Sometimes
Being intentional to grow.
but not only that, sometimes you are going to be working for an employer or a company or organization where the responsibility is on yourself to
right.
get what you need.
That's right.
And if you know how you learn, if you know how you assimilate information, if you know how you process, then you can get that for yourself. And then you're not waiting on anybody. You're a leg up. And
yep.
So
That's
book
very good. Very
recommendations
important.
for
I'd like for our listeners, if you want more information on the things that we talk about, check us out at foxygenconsulting.com. Reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk to you. And we love your comments, so keep them coming. Thanks for listening.
go read more books.
Or listen. The Healthy Hurried Human podcast is presented by Foxygen Consulting. At Foxygen, we provide business and performance psychology and consulting. We believe healthier people make a healthier workplace. Foxygen Consulting, breathing new life into your organization.